percentage of someone's income or below market rate. And we have apartments designed for that. A little bit about our track record before I jump into some projects. So it doesn't sound like a huge amount, but for us, it's massive. We've completed over 400 homes, and these 414, I think, homes are spread across 12 buildings. Most of them are here in Melbourne, but also in regional Victoria, Adelaide, Fremantle, and we're just about to open a project in Marrickville in Sydney. We hope we can come to Queensland as well. Among these, we have 62 homes for community housing providers. This is a photo taken inside a community housing home in Nightingale Housing. And as you can see, there's no difference. Our apartments are all the same. It's considered tenure blind, and they are scattered throughout the building. They're not lumped in one spot or on the ground floor or whatever it might be. They're truly salt and peppered through the building. We have 254 homes under construction at the moment, and it's a busy time. Here is one of our resident communities getting together as they see their building start to be constructed. And of those homes under construction, around 80 homes for community housing providers. We like to talk about why we started and why we exist. And in some ways, our ultimate goal is to not exist. We wish that housing was equitable for all people in Australia, but as I'm sure you're all aware, that's currently not the state. We are in a housing crisis across all of Australia, in regional areas, in cities, for families, for single people, for couples, whoever it might be. And it's a crisis that presents itself on three fronts. For us, it's a social crisis. It's a lack of access to infrastructure, of car-dependent developments and isolated lots. It's an environmental crisis. We are all acutely aware of the environmental crisis we face and the danger that this poses to the future of our planet. And lastly, we are in a financial crisis, with the cost of living and access to secure housing severely broken. There's incredible wealth disparity in Australia, and overall, we're an incredibly privileged and lucky country. And I think this even further exemplifies that this inaccess to affordable housing in Australia is really apparent. I'm going to go through a few statistics that we've gathered over the last year or so. In Melbourne, Victoria, it now takes 11 years for a medium income family to save a 20% deposit for their home, let alone what it may take a single person. 90%, according to the Community Housing Industry Association, of 18 to 39-year-olds, so I'm in that bracket, don't think they'll ever get into the property market. But I think what's something important for us to notice is that we're in a housing crisis, not particularly an ownership crisis. We've historically been focused on home ownership at Nightingale, and home ownership and homes as asset are a huge part of the problem. But there is a lack of affordable and long-term options available for so many people, be it renting or buying. Community and government policies and actions must move from treating housing primarily as a means of wealth creation and as a way of providing secure housing. This is some statistics from some recent research across subsidised housing in other cities that, we would say we're on a similar quality of life to. In Australia, around 4.2% of people have access to subsidised housing. So that may be through rent assistance, through community housing providers, or social housing. In London, that figure sits at 45. In Vienna, that sits at 40. London, 24, Vienna, 45, and Amsterdam, 47. And it doesn't mean that people at all income brackets are getting their houses paid for, but it may be getting subsidised to some extent so that it may become more affordable for them. So our response. faced with this crisis, we design, as I talked about before, buildings for people, not profit. It's about building homes, not real estate as a commodity. And it's about fostering community to combat rising social isolation. We don't make a profit. And if we do, it has to get returned to mission to deliver more housing. So we sell our homes at cost. There's no developer incentives for us to provide that. One of our key principles, if you've ever heard Nightingale people talk before, is we talk about building less. This is a photo from Nightingale 1. And as you can see, it's pretty stripped back. Breathe designed this project. Breathe are an architecture firm that we've worked with on many projects. Their founder was also our founder. So we strip back services, we strip back plasterboard ceilings, we expose ducting, and we take pride in functionality. This project used form ply that was used on another job to form the concrete slab, for example, and it's been used in this project. Our new projects, this project has recycled timber floors. At the scale we're currently operating, it's no longer feasible. We can't actually get the volume of recycled floorboards to do the homes we want now. But we're using cork floors, a carbon positive material to be used across the floor that's acoustically great as well. We've reduced the amount of concrete. This project did have a lot of concrete in it. We're constantly evolving and learning. So we're reducing the amount of concrete due to embodied carbon on our new projects. We use materials with no VOCs and where possible, raw metal fixtures, be it brass, steel, aluminium, or copper. One of our more recent kind of visible moves, and it doesn't even seem like a big deal, but it kind of exemplifies the extent to which we scrutinize materials. As you can see in this photo here, there's a red fire pipe. We questioned the fire services and said, can we not paint it? Can we just leave it galvanized and just strip back one more process, one more material? It took a little bit of work, and other architects have done this as well. We're not the first to do it. But it's working, and we now have galvanized fire pipes, exposed services as well. And so by building less, we're able to give more. This is a photo of Nightingale 1's rooftop. And it might sound simple, but we remove whatever we can and make what is left beautiful and functional. I'm chewing through slides here, but connected communities. So this is the building I used to live in. I was a renter in this building here, the Commons, and this photo is taken from Nightingale 1. We kind of base our projects as close as we can to train lines, as you can see here. We design acoustically for these train lines. Often we're especially acoustic treated to the train line face of the building and to utilize the existing infrastructure. So this project shows we've got a bike path, we've got people running, we've got a train, and directly behind us, there's actually a tram track a few hundred meters up the road.
What the heck do you mean by
so our buildings are fossil fuel free. There is no gas plumbed into our building. All cooking and heating is electric. Gas is one of the biggest polluters and has significant health impacts on people at many stages of interaction with it. And many other developers and architects have assisted on this gas-free path. On top of this, so we take out gas, we electrify everything, and then our buildings are powered by 100% green power. We have solar panels on every roof, electric heat pumps operating like a battery, and for the additional power required, that solar does not cover all the power usage. We buy 100% green power direct from wind, solar, and hydro producers. As you can see here, we build with robust quality materials. This is Nightingale 1. I went into this apartment the other day and it actually looks even better now than it did. Maybe this is probably 2 or 3 years in. It's a beautiful thing to see these apartments age well rather than deteriorate with use. We're based in Melbourne. So we're more of a heating climate, though that is changing at the moment. Our homes are highly insulated. In most cases, we don't have any air conditioning. And heating is provided by a centralized high efficiency electric heat pump. Our most recent building was on average 8.4 NatHERS stars. That was the average, with some apartments rising up to 9.4 stars. So they have an incredibly well-sealed thermal envelope. As I mentioned before, though, we are constantly evolving and changing, and air conditioner technology has dramatically improved in the last few years. There are better refrigerants. We still avoid particular refrigerants with a global warming potential. And we may be using aircon in future projects. So shared facilities. One of the most important features of our homes are their shared facilities. These have a functional purpose, but they also mean that people interact with each other. We have shared laundries on the rooftops and dining areas, and this also creates equitable use for all. So by sharing facilities, it means that there may be people in these buildings that don't have access to be able to buy a washing machine or a clothes dryer or whatever it might be. And by co-locating these on the roof, we have a kind of equitable outcome in regards to affordability. By sharing those services too, it does mean that your bills are reduced. One thing that helped us to kind of create some community space was to have a bath on the roof. Not everyone or barely any of our homes have a bath in their house. And this philosophy of sharing resources, of saving space has been continued to the bathhouse. One of our key moves in addressing housing affordability and creating diversity of stock over the last few years has been the introduction of a tile house. Tile house means part of house. It's a German word or a concept coined by Breathe Architecture on an older Nightingale project. And tile house apartments are space-efficient, small footprint homes that maintain functionality through joinery. They're small, but it means you get access to the whole building, or the whole house, as we like to say. By building smaller, they not only have a lower carbon footprint, but they're also cheaper. So these apartments for people have been incredibly affordable. And a lot of people have found them an incredible relief to their housing situation. There's something we'll continue across all of our projects where possible. We often face barriers with planning laws against their size, but we maintain that they're an incredible option for those that they suit. In our Nightingale Marrickville project, our Sydney project, there's 55 tile houses there. And that means that we can rent them out at a cheaper rate purely because they're smaller, but everyone still has access to amenity. Something that we bang on about a lot is sustainable transport. In where we locate our buildings is the first step, but encouraging sustainable transport is the second. Cars can be a bit of a money trap for a lot of people. They're expensive to run, operate, service, park, etc. And they also have a huge impact on the environment. We partner with organizations like this e-bike company and have go-get cars in the basement that allow people to find cheaper solutions to their transport. Our homes are sold at cost, so we pass on any savings that we make in the build process directly onto residents. 20% are sold directly to a community housing provider, and 20% go towards a priority ballot. The priority ballot is a stream of people that have historically faced inequality or difficulty accessing the housing market. It may be people with disability, Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people, key community contributors, and single women aged 55 plus, who are the largest growing cohort of people experiencing homelessness in Australia. Now, these people are able to purchase our homes And often they may pick the apartments that suit them best. Talking too much at the end of the day, hey? And the remaining are sold via the general ballot. So we might just click through some slides of some projects that we've done. So for this series, there's a map here on the right-hand side, and it shows this white line is the train line. Over here to the right of that is that tram line, that next main light. And we'll start just kind of showing how we have created a network of buildings across this kind of region. The Commons has 24 homes and was awarded the best of the best in the Sustainability Awards. Just across the road here, you may have seen photos of this project, is Nightingale 1, 20 homes. Down the road and in between these buildings is Florence Street Parklet. It's not much. It's just a little dead end street, but it's a place of activity and life that we continuously activate with resident events. Up the train line is Nightingale Anstey, which is 54 homes, tile houses, affordable rentals. And down the train line there is Nightingale Evergreen. So Nightingale Evergreen is the first in 6 of the buildings in Nightingale Village. Nightingale Evergreen was designed by Claire Cousins, architect. Claire is an incredible architect and has been an absolute force on this project. As you can see here, she's really adhered to the robustness and stripped back materials. And this is a north-facing apartment, 1-bedroom apartment in there. Next to there, you have Nightingale Parklife. I'm currently sitting in my friend's house in Nightingale Parklife. It's designed by Austin Maynard Architects. As you can see, there's kind of materials selections that continue across buildings, but through minimal things like paint or just raw materials, you can see that they allow different personalities. We have Nightingale Left Field, designed by Kennedy Nolan Architects, 28 homes. This is their rooftop. It's got a beautiful kind of sunny rooftop deck. This space has since grown incredibly lush. We have Nightingale Courtyard, designed by Hayball Architects, a larger Melbourne firm who created an incredible project here. This project, in regards to its design, was centered around a central courtyard and had a variety of apartments available. We had Sky House, 42 homes, designed by Breathe Architecture. And this is a shot of the interiors there. This project has a mixture of 2 housing providers in it. So it has Housing Choices Australia and Women's Property Initiatives. And they rent those 20% of this building is rented out at affordable rates to either of those 2 groups. And lastly, Urban Coop. Urban Coop is a slightly different project designed by Architecture and Breathe. And it's almost more of a intentional community where a group of people came to Nightingale to assist them with developing their home. Now, some projects under construction. Nightingale Wuru Bik, 99 homes are located just north. Nightingale Willumgunna, designed by 6 Degrees, right on that train line as well. And then down the road, we're about to start construction on 282 homes down south of this called Naga Terrabuk, which means dancing branches. We have projects in WA, Nightingale Fremantle. We have an incredible project in Adelaide, Nightingale Bowden, which this, in regards to affordable housing, this was part of an urban renewal precinct. And it was master planned by Renewal South Australia. And this project was sold at affordable rates throughout the entire property. So the government subsidised the cost of the land and assisted with the development. And 50% of the project is affordable rentals and 50% was affordable purchase. We have Nightingale Preston, which is a similar project, and hopefully Nightingale Brompton in South Australia coming up as well. We recently completed, or a few years ago, completed Nightingale Ballarat, You can see here we reused a lot of materials here. This is solid recycled brick in line with existing buildings. And one of our older projects is Nightingale 2 in Fairfield, designed by 6 Degrees Architects. An incredible project as well as Nightingale Brunswick East, and about to go into construction, Nightingale Umarki Way, designed by Kennedy Nolan. Now, this project, Nightingale Marrickville, is based in New South Wales. There's 55 homes there. And this is a new project for us. It's our first rental, full rental. It's land that is owned by a church group. There was a church on this side of land, and they looked at it and they were like, we can do better here. This church is currently utilized for Bible studies about 2 hours a week by 12 people. And for them, that wasn't delivering on mission. They said what this community needs right now is affordable housing. And they came to Nightingale and said, will you assist us in looking at this site? So they are the developer, and we'll be renting out these units starting next week. Actually, I'm going up on next weekend to have an open for inspection for potential tenants. And they're rented at 80% of market rent in the Marrickville area. We hope that projects like this will cause others to do the same and take an initiative within their own council. I guess some of the things that we face as barriers, and we're pretty happy to talk about all our wins and all our beautiful projects and the incredible architecture. But I think some of the things that I just wanted to talk about this evening is having access to land. Land prices in Sydney have locked us out of Sydney, essentially. They're too expensive for us to build affordable homes on, sadly. And land is getting harder and harder to come by. It's also a tricky concept in Australia where it's unceded land as well. And so we're essentially building on stolen land. We'd be open to many different initiatives in regards to leasing land or government-owned land or land trusts, but primarily we do buy and develop on land. Something that's a huge barrier to us and to many people is access to impact investment. So if we are trying to deliver affordable housing, the cost of the money to develop, we don't have a huge bank balance. We don't have money in the bank per se. We have to go and find people to invest or to loan us money. Now, in Australia, there's this expectation that if you lend someone money, you need to make a healthy return. That's kind of an investment term, which can add percentages and percentages on top of the cost of housing. So for us, if there was greater access to impact investment, which is investment based on a lower return, we believe that housing prices could go down. And of course, as you're probably aware, and as you'll see, that construction costs has escalated significantly over the last few years. There's also challenges for the CHPs, which are the community housing providers, though the recent change, or relatively recent change in federal government, has meant that things like the HAF fund is changing the way this looks at. I know that the Victorian state government is taking initiatives at the moment, and the Queensland government has recently released a raft of changes and targets for affordable housing in the state. So we hope that this can assist CHPs, community housing providers, in providing housing. So just maybe want to finish on a little bit of a positive note before I hand over to Quino and to question time. But what we hope for is connected communities for people of all ages, diversities, incomes living together and having access to the same good infrastructure and services. We want activated streets. We want people out living their lives on the street, in their community and with their neighbours. And we want this is a photo of what Nightingale Village used to look like, underutilized industrial land in well-connected and well-serviced urban to this. And this photo is probably from a few years ago. It looks even better now. There's book sale there on the weekend. There's incredible access to beautiful things there. And so some things that we like to talk about in regards to what we have been learning and things we're currently advocate for is that there's a notion that there's a stigmatization towards high density or to providing housing with affordable housing tenants inside. What we found is there's actually a stigmatization towards poor quality development. And also for us, the provision of community housing within our developments of a kind of self-enforced mixed tenure has become a big part of our identity and a reason that people want to support us. So for us, it's important to note that. There's kind of 5 actions that we believe could have an impact on housing affordability in Australia. One is tax reform across Australia to address, which governments have tried before and perhaps not been successful in, and also there's been some movement on this recently, but cancelling the stage 3 tax cuts and fund initiatives to improve housing affordability. It would also be excellent to get rid of capital gains tax concessions and negative gearing. That's a big thing for politicians to promote. But that's what we believe in. We also believe in planning reform, where you streamline planning pathways that benefit the occupant and community and implement mandatory inclusionary zoning to enshrine a component of affordable housing in all new developments. In regards to public land and public housing, our belief is that the government should retain public ownership of public land where possible, rather than selling to private groups. And affordable housing should always increase if that happens. We believe that there should be greater support for alternative models, so greater government and institutional support for newer and internationally proven housing models, including the community housing sector, shared equity schemes, community land trusts, and cooperative housing models, and as well, of course, not-for-profit developers, and also First Nations knowledge. So there should be a greater direct investment in First Nations organisations and community consultation to create self-determined outcomes and culturally appropriate outcomes for First Nations Australians. They're kind of 5 things that we hope to change or hope to advocate for. But just one thing that's been discussed in our office over the last week is this term of affordability. It was brought up at a recent summit on affordable housing in Melbourne, is that housing affordability is a relatively abstract term, and that we don't talk about coffee affordability or car affordability. We talk about the cost and the price. And I think at the moment in Australia, as Richard Dennis, head of the Australian, chief economist for the Australian Institute, have said, is that the price of housing is too high, and that currently there's not enough people that wish for the price of housing to go down. We hope that that will change, and we hope that we can kind of have a big impact on changing housing affordability and access to housing in Australia. So thank you for listening, and thanks for listening to a bit of a burn through of many of our projects. Thank you.
Thank you, Toby. Remarkable body of work, which everyone that's contributed obviously can be extremely proud. Global leadership, really. So we'll defer questions till after our second speaker. And I'm pleased to introduce Quino Holland from Fieldwork, and it's we're very fortunate to have a firm like Fieldwork presenting. a leading award-winning practice in a pretty interesting market in Melbourne. So, Quino, you might say a few words about yourself and how you got to where you are, and jump into your presentation.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Toby, for that presentation. And Mark, thanks very much for the introduction. So yeah, my name's Quino and I'm design director at Fieldwork. And I'm also one of the original founders of Assemble, which is a, well, now quite a large scale development company with really a focus on delivering housing for moderate income Australians. Tonight, or this evening, I'm going to talk to you in a bit of detail about 4 projects. I had intended to speak to you about some of our social and affordable housing that we're doing, but unfortunately, because the session is being recorded and there's quite a large audience, we weren't able to get the permission from the government to show the project. It's still a confidential project, but that is a social housing project. So instead, I'm going to focus in a bit of detail on 4 projects that we've designed for Assemble. I had a little bit of a technology meltdown before. Apologies, my camera from the main computer is not working, so I'm going to have to be using 2 computers to make this work. So hopefully this will work, fingers crossed.
You might just consider trying to make that a full screen view, Quino, if that's easy. Yep, great.
There we go.
Thank you. Yep.
Well, first of all, I want to pay my respects to the traditional owners. So here in Melbourne, we're on the lands of the Wurundjeri, and we work primarily on the lands of the Wurundjeri and the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation. And look, I want to pay my respects to the elders past and present, and extend my respect to any First Nations people who are with us this evening. It's a little bit of a delay, unfortunately. So for those of you in Queensland, so we're in Naarm, Melbourne. The first project I want to talk to you about is actually the first Assemble project. So when I was sort of a younger architect, this was about 15 years ago now, we founded the company Assemble, actually before we founded Fieldwork. So Fieldwork as an architecture practice is actually an offshoot of the original Assemble. We founded Assemble because there was an enormous frustration among myself and my peers that no one was really delivering the kind of housing that we want to be a part of. You know, really the options for us at the time were, you know, a little rundown Victorian terrace house in one of the inner suburbs, or pretty low quality sort of 1960s apartment stock, 1950s and 60s apartment stock. No one's really delivering any new housing that we really want to be a part of. The site that I want to talk to you about was completed about 5 years ago after a very long conception sort of process. And I'm happy to say I'm still living there. So myself, my business partner, Giuseppe, my ex-business partner, Giuseppe, my current business partner, Ben Keck, and our team member, who's now our associate director, Brian, who's the project lead, is still living in this project sort of 5 years later. It's been a really beautiful project to be in. It's a 3,000 square meter site. It's surrounded by single-story Victorian terrace houses. And it's one of these quite typical inner Melbourne suburbs where there's a scattering of small workers' cottages and remnant sort of industrial warehouses that are slowly being converted. It was actually quite a handsome, quite sort of brutalist building. I really wanted to hang on to the whole thing. Interestingly enough, a big part of what we did with this first project was did a lot of community engagement. And we actually met with the local heritage groups. And the local heritage groups really hated this building. We had a bit of a battle actually to try and hang on to it. But ultimately, we were very keen to, because I suppose, you know, if sustainability is one of your key tenets, which certainly is for Assemble and very much is for Fieldwork as well, you know, don't build sort of unnecessarily and don't demolish unnecessarily. So we really try to hang on as much as possible. So I wanted to also mention that, you know, a big part of what we were trying to do with Assemble was sort of public advocacy. And I think Nightingale's really carrying that torch in an incredibly effective and beautiful way at the moment. We set up Assemble Papers. It's a publication that continues today. It's been running now for about 12 years. It's largely online now, but it used to be a print publication that came out 4 times a year. And really the theme was the culture of living closer together. So it was very much about advocating for, the ideas of densification, for sustainability, for First Nations engagement, and really ultimately about trying to make cities better places for everyone to live. Here's a couple of random dudes reading assembled papers. We were able, through assembled papers, to run a whole series of talks and lecture series, and really focused as well our efforts on advocacy to government as well, and that very much continues with Assembled today. We used to distribute copies of assembled papers to all the councils and also local to the Victorian state government as well. So when we started this project many years ago now, because I said it was like quite a long conception process for it, we decided not to just come at it as architects and sort of just impose our kind of ideas, but rather we ran a whole series of design workshops and design presentations and some very detailed survey work we did with prospective purchasers to work out what people actually wanted. Because at the time, it was very much determined by, what real estate agents thought people wanted when it came to designing their apartments. And in a way, what this helped us to do was to really refine down what are the things that really matter to people who want to live in apartments long term. The project that we came up with after a long consultation process was a mix of townhouses and apartments. So this is an axonometric view here. Really, what you have is 3-story townhouses on either side of the site, and then through the middle, a double-loaded apartment building with these large open staircases, which kind of acts like almost a neighborhood stoop. The sort of classic Brooklyn stoop where you've got a sort of north-facing staircase and everyone kind of hangs out there, and that works really beautifully. And then we've got raised landscape spaces, and here's a sort of cross-section through it. So we had a few issues. One of them was that we had actually quite a contaminated site, so we couldn't, and also we didn't want to spend all this money building an expensive basement. Very much like Nightingale, we wanted to focus where we spent the money on the things that really sort of matter to the end occupant. But as a cross-section, you see through here the 3-story townhouses on the side. We were very, very keen from the outset to make sure it's a very diverse community. So we designed it to have a real mix of different apartment sizes and types. And it's actually been a very successful community from the point of view of being diverse. We've got, elderly people all the way through to very young people and families. And it's a lovely, diverse community. And one of the things that's really helped to make the community diverse is with these townhouses, we had the ground floor be actually it's able to be a completely separate unit. So it's literally this idea of a granny flat. And what's really cute in the building, we've actually got 2 grannies living in separate little granny flats. So they're downstairs in their little granny flat, and then the middle floor is the living space and the bedrooms, with the sort of younger family above. And look, if there's any detailed questions about any of these projects at the end, we can always come back to these plans. But really, this is a car park. And look, I'm going to talk in a bit of detail about car parking when we come to the next project. There's, I suppose, an important point to be made there. In designing this building, we really not only did these sort of surveys, but also did a really systematic analysis of, what are the perceived and actual disadvantages in apartment living? What are the things that you can't do in a sort of typical apartment building? And I'd also spent 4 years living in Denmark and got incredibly inspired by the communal sort of housing that happens over there. So we incorporated a couple of features into this building that have been really successful. The first one is a multi-purpose communal workshop. And rather than putting it right at the back of the car park, we've put it right at the front of the building. And we also have a communal room. So that's right at the front of the building here. It's a 65 square meter space. It's owned collectively by everyone in the building. So we all own it. There's an online booking system. And it's a really great space because it's adjacent to a little outdoor barbecue area. It's right next to the staircase where you sort of come up. And it's this really lovely sort of little hub that fosters real neighborliness. And look, the whole idea of this building is that it's actually about encouraging neighborliness and the kind of interaction between people and really about sort of striking that balance between privacy and ensuring that, putting privacy screens and things in don't result in isolation. And as you got through the building, you can see it's a sort of double-loaded building. You'll see that in the second project we did for Assemble, we learned from a lot of the mistakes we also made in this project. You know, with architecture, every building is a kind of prototype and you learn a lot of things. The biggest mistake we made in this project is that we actually had gas in the building, you know, so that's something that we're now working with the residents to try and actually retrofit. It's funny how quickly sort of things change. By the time it was like, everyone's got to have gas stoves, you know, this is sort of 7, 8 years ago. Now it just seems crazy to put gas in anywhere. Some of the views of the building, I mean, one thing that we've always focused on very hard, especially with the assemble projects, is trying to like work out how we can dematerialize the buildings as much as possible and try and reduce the amount of embodied carbon in them. So, you know, this is all sort of very lightweight sort of aluminium screening. You can see the staircases leading up and that remnant 2-story portion of the Brutalist warehouse that we were able to hang on to and retrofit apartments into that. On the ground floor, we've got a little hospitality space facing north. And this is a sort of pretty typical scene out the front. By having those large staircases that lead down, no gates, it seems like a very small thing, but actually we have to work very hard to convince all the stakeholders involved to not put gates on those 2 staircases. Anyone can wander up, and it's proved to be a very successful thing because it is this kind of invitation to the community, but anyone that does come up is very respectful. You know, you speak to this idea of passive surveillance, and this is a space that you really feel that passive surveillance works very beautifully. The other thing is that out the front, we've got that multi-purpose communal workshop, and it's not a glamorous space, but it works as this lovely, I suppose, it's a space that really does foster that sense of enablingness. And I just took this little snap a couple of years ago now. This was actually just before COVID, but it's a fairly typical sort of scene. The multi-purpose communal workshop, what it's got is a sort of workbench. It's got a dog washing area. More on that in a minute, by the way. That was a mistake to put it in there. A communal laundry. So all the apartments have got laundry spaces, but we also incorporated a free communal laundry. And that was very interesting, especially during COVID. A lot of people actually didn't put washing machines into their space, and they've retrofitted their little laundry areas into workspaces. So put sort of desks in there. And there's also a bike stand as well. So, you know, this is Janet, who's one of our lovely neighbors, and she's having her bike repaired by one of our other neighbors. And then, you know, the fact that this is also next to the lobby, you get those little sort of glimpses into it. You make eye contact, you sort of wave to each other, neighborliness. Going up the staircases now, you know, that sort of idea, like I said, of that sort of north-facing stoop. The landscape's been a real success in this project. And you can see here on the left-hand side, the townhouses, and on the right-hand side, the apartments. The apartments that face east and west have actually got operable sliding shutters, which really help to cut out that sort of harsh eastern and western sun. So that's an example of a feature of the building that we actually surveyed the prospective residents about, you know, whether that was an important feature for them to have and whether they'd be willing to invest a little bit more into their apartments in order to be able to afford to have operable shading. And the overwhelmingly positive response to that meant that we included those operable shades, which have been really fantastic, actually, especially these sort of hot summer months. This sort of walkway and communal landscape space has been really successful, especially with children. So there's a number of families with children on this floor. And what's lovely is it's a space where, you know, the kids can just sort of run to see each other, visit each other, and it's an example as well of that, where you sort of that balance of sort of privacy and sort of openness. So really the landscape as it's established itself really is providing the main privacy screening between the walkway and the private courtyards. And then in the northern end, you can see this sort of barbecue space there. And that barbecue space has actually been really wonderful. It's actually been a lovely thing to have this facility, which is almost acts like, I guess, a little community hall that we all co-own. So there's been a lot of community functions there. There's, you know, a dinner party there almost every weekend. I've had my daughter's birthday party there. There's even a kind of funny Dungeons and Dragons club that happens there, and all these people sort of playing these funny role-playing games there as well. The second project I want to talk to you about was when Assemble partnered up with Make Ventures, and Australian Superannuation became a sort of key investor. And this is where Assemble started its new chapter. And its new chapter is a very innovative sort of financial model that allows you to pre-agree a price, live in the apartment for 5 years, renting, and then to purchase at the end of those 5 years for a pre-agreed price. This has been a bit of a game changer for those residents who participated in it, because it has, I suppose, first of all, taken a lot of the anxiety and uncertainty out of rental. So that sort of certainty of tenure for those 5 years, a very fixed and certain goal, that you're working towards. Assemble also provides financial coaching along that journey. And then at the end of the 5 years, being able to purchase the home. Assemble is now working to increase the sort of flexibility of that, where people can actually purchase the home sooner than the 5 years. And what's wonderful about it as well is that it gives you an opportunity to actually, experience the home before committing to buy it as well. So that's a sort of quite a wonderful thing as well, because there's an enormous amount of anxiety about buying off the plan. So this is in Kensington, which is in the inner west of Melbourne, adjacent to Mooney Creek. It's a corner site. So this was really going to be the pilot for this sort of new chapter of Assemble. And we wanted to take all of our learnings from the first project, all the mistakes that we made in the first project, and really try to make this, a better sort of project. So it was quite an important historical building on the site. So we were very, very keen to retain as much as possible of it. It's Harry Norris is quite a well-known DDoC modern or sort of Art Deco architect here in Melbourne, designed a lot of these very beautiful sort of Art Deco buildings. And it's actually had a bit of an interesting history. It's a site where they produced CDs and cassettes, and a recording studio as well. And actually the owner of the site owns the warehouse next door, and a lot of these facilities have moved across. And it turns out they're still making CDs. It's crazy. There's actually still a market out there for CDs. Sort of funny things like sort of nautical manuals and things still need to have CDs. So there's a bit of an industry there. So there's all these sort of wonderful old machines in there. And a series of sort of diagrams that sort of explain our design thinking with the site. So that's the existing building. A typical sort of approach, and in fact, the approach we took in the first Assemble project would be to do a double-loaded apartment building, where you've got apartments on either side of a central corridor and a lift. We wanted to do something a lot better than that. So what we did was to split the building open. And what this does is it fundamentally improves the daylight, amenity, and most importantly, cross-flow ventilation. You can draw all the little wiggly arrows you want on the double-loaded apartment plan. You don't get true cross-flow ventilation unless you've got proper windows on both sides of the building. And look, it was a real leap of faith for the whole sort of project team. And we're very grateful as well to Melbourne City Council, who really sort of jumped on board with this idea. They actually allowed us to challenge or actually to step out of some of the planning envelopes. So this iteration here would have fit in the planning envelopes. They sort of allowed us to challenge and reduce the setbacks because they really believed, in the improvements, the amenity that would result from this. And in this project, there's a huge focus on the communal amenity as well, which I'll speak to in a bit more detail in a moment. Here's a cross section, so you can see the retained sort of warehouse space, and we tried to retain it for at least a room depth. But the main thing I want to point out here is that with every single apartment gets a completely private terrace, and in this case, facing south or facing north. And look, that's the other reason, is the orientation of the site. We wanted to try and get as much northern light into all the apartments. With a double-loaded building, a completely south-facing apartment, it's impossible to get any northern light into it. So each apartment gets a totally private terrace, and then their living spaces connect back through to a series of little bridges that go into the communal walkway in the middle. So these are they're sort of semi-private sort of access spaces through the back. Some views of the building. we wanted the building, and I suppose similar to the philosophy of Nightingale, is not to sort of, put into the building anything sort of unnecessary. There was already this incredibly ornate, quite sort of beautiful heritage base. We wanted it to be quite a sort of pared back building in behind. And here you can see some sort of views of that. On the north, we've got these ribbon balconies that wrap along the full length of the facade. With a series of these sort of perforated screens, but those deep eaves work really, really nicely in summer. We try to minimize the windows facing west. This project is 100% gas-free, and it's also it's actually powered entirely by a wind farm in Hepburn. So Assemble's made a deal with Hepburn Wind, which is really exciting. So there's a sort of direct correlation between the sort of energy producer and the building, which is wonderful. All the glazing in this is thermally broken. It's sort of crazy that it's not mandated in Australia for everyone to have thermally broken. I think things are thankfully slowly shifting there, but double glazing sort of came in about 10, 15 years ago. And look, I think we will all hopefully need to be putting in, or mandated to put in, thermally broken frames going forward. So with this building, things like the thermally broken frames are examples of where we really try to invest in the things that make buildings really, pleasant to be in. And the other big focus for us with these Assemble projects, in fact, all our projects, but specifically Assemble projects, is acoustic separation between apartments. That was a really, really big push that we made in our first project. And in this one as well, it's very nice living all close together, but you don't want to hear your neighbors, You can see through here, there's sort of drone shots showing the communal walkway. And at the top, where there's the very best amenity, the very best outlook, the sort of very best space in the building, that's the communally owned communal room. So that's really about democratizing access to the very best views, the very best sort of amenity in the building. So coming in a bit closer, that sort of little balcony is this kind of little gesture of that sort of community moment. And then the materiality, which is this sort of vertically ribbed precast concrete. And I'll speak to materials in a bit more detail in one of the subsequent projects when we get to the moment, because concrete's a very big issue for us. Some plans at the ground floor. So there's a lobby space. There's a cafe, which is actually owned and operated by Assemble. So one of the things with Assemble is to, especially as Assemble projects get bigger and bigger, like the current projects are sort of a couple of hundred apartments, is how do you still have that sort of feeling of personalization and personal, and not have a concierge, essentially. So what we have here instead is a cafe downstairs where the staff in the cafe are also trained to, deal with sort of building issues and also get to know the residents' names. And, if you want to have your mum come and drop off a key for you and you sort of pick it up, that's the sort of, facility can make that happen. We've got a larger and improved version of the communal workshop right at the front of the building. We've also got a parcel delivery room. So these are just all these little sort of pragmatic things that one really works through. And then we've actually got a full dehydrator composting system, which actually means that 100%, it's actually like a $40,000 machine, but it was a really worthwhile investment. It means that we've got much less waste going to landfill. 100% of all the green waste from the cafe and all the residents gets turned into this beautiful compost there. And look, we're incredibly proud of that, because that, organic waste going into landfill is a really huge source of methane, and it's one of those, I think one of those things that we really got to address. Lots of bike parking. Now, car parking, this is a big one. So we did an enormous amount of, thinking and research, and, with all the surveying that we did of the prospective purchasers, we realized that there was, a demand for some apartments with cars. We had, because the focus for Assemble is sort of moderate income households, we had a lot of sort of tradespeople. We had people who needed work vehicles, and also people who, have families. So there was an element of demand for car parks. So what we did is we designed into the project the number of cars based on the demand. But the way that, look, car parking is a real dilemma for us going forward, especially the spaces that we set aside for car parking. So the way it works with assemble projects, and this one in particular, is that we try to design the car parks so they can be retrofitted to be turned into something else in the future. So this has actually got direct access out onto the street. It's got windows facing the laneway, and they're not strata titled. So even when the building is transferred to the owners at the end of the 5-year period, the way it works is that you rent your car space off the body corporate. So for the first 5 years, you're renting it off assemble. And then once the ownership of the building transfers across to the residents, you rent it off the body corporate. And the idea is that if car ownership patterns change, so, you know, as we get more self-driving cars, or, you know, the way that we sort of approach vehicles broadly changes and demand reduces, that some of that or all of that space could be retrofitted to something else. There's going to be this real issue in the future where we've got all these basement car parks with strata titled cars. You know, it's almost impossible to turn those into anything else. So some views of the lobby space. So we had to actually mediate between the lower level of the street, and then actually had to lift the ground floor up because there's a flooding overlay on the site. So to mediate that height difference, rather than putting in a sort of conventional ramp, we've got a very gentle 1 in 20 ramp. And we always try and do 1 in 20 ramps because it means you don't have to have the handrails. It's much more sort of gentle. And also we incorporated the soft fall recycled rubber covering, because the building is also very much designed to be a place for children. So we've got lots of children in this building, and for pets. So, you know, the choice of materials, things like this very robust dado that runs through. So we've actually tiled all the communal spaces up to a certain height, because we learned from our first assemble project where we didn't have these sort of robust surfaces, people with dogs and kids and prams and all those sort of things, it all gets sort of very scuffed up. So, you know, part of designing these buildings to make sure that they age in a kind of graceful way. And you can see in the lobby that there's also windows through the communal workshop. That's a view of the sort of communal workshop, a very sort of basic space, but it gets incredibly well utilized. And really that was as a result of the kind of research we did, that, you know, one thing that was really missing in apartment buildings was someone to do those sort of messy jobs. A view of the floor plans on level 1, we've got some additional amenity spaces, washing lines, a herb garden, and a very popular facility here, which is a dog washing area. So we really advertised this building as being dog friendly. We've got 76 apartments and 52 dogs are living in this building. It is dog crazy. And one of the things that we came up with was also each balcony's got just little things, right? So each balcony has got a tap point, so hose, you know, so dogs do their sort of business on the balconies. And also we put into all the apartments in the sliding, next to the sliding doors, a solid panel which is easy to cut out for a dog door. So, you know, as it turns out, dogs are all different sizes. We looked into all these different systems, but it turns out the best system is to actually just give everyone a panel and then the phone number of an installer that you have to do the system to then go and cut the hole, you know, for a little tiny one for a little sausage dog, or a big one for a big, you know, German Shepherd. And that's, there's also a little bit of a kids sort of play area, sandpit, that works quite nicely as well. So here's the plan. Much like Nightingale, you know, we do focus as well on saying, let's spend the money on the things that are gonna, you know, have a positive impact on people's lives. So this is why we always try to vertically stack everything really efficiently. Like, we work very hard with our engineers. So this same floor plan goes all the way up. It used to be always that it'd be like all the smaller apartments at the bottom and then the big penthouses on top. And in fact, that's what we did at Roseneath Street, the first assemble project. Whereas with this one, we said, no, let's take the same floor plan. So 3-bedders, for example, in the top left-hand corner, and then run that all the way up through the building, and then run all the 2-bedders up the building. So that just allows us to have much more cost-efficient structure, much more cost-efficient services. Now, from a floor plan point of view, the way each apartment of the 2-bedders works is you've got sort of living spaces, kitchen, living, dining, bathrooms, bedroom facing out towards to the north, and then a second bedroom facing south. And then each apartment's got these little bridges that come across from that central walkway. I'll talk about this little curved space in a moment as well. So this is an example of where one can come up with a beautiful solution from a bit of a challenge. So when we were starting, at the end of the tender process, we're advised by the builders that they needed the space to put the tower crane, and that there'd be a lot of cost savings if they put a tower crane in and not have to come back and pour slabs on each level. So it was going to result in this big sort of ugly rectangular hole punched right in the middle of our floor plan. And instead, we turned it into this sort of beautiful curved space, and it's become a really loved feature of the building. You can see the kind of materiality, again, similar to Nightingale. And funnily, Toby, you should mention that, but yeah, for subsequent projects, we've also managed to get the red paint removed from the galvanized pipes. But what we've got is the exposed concrete, very much exposed surfaces. It actually makes it easier for trades to be able to go and effect any repairs if necessary. Then we've got handrails, and then this very delicate stainless steel mesh that runs up, and we've got plants starting to grow up through them. The other thing about this arrangement is it allows you to get these diagonal views down and through the building. So you're not just in a sort of layer cake, but rather getting a sense of what's going on down below. And then a sort of view through the mesh. I'm really interested in these little sort of 60s and 70s walk-up apartments that we have scattered through Melbourne. And one of the things that's very beautiful about them is the way that the circulation spaces, the communal spaces, become like extensions of people's internal space, the way that people sort of spill out onto them. They have little pot plants and bicycles and, little tables and chairs. And also really love, classic sort of Victorian terrace houses, that little interface between private and public, which is the front veranda. And I actually lived, this wasn't my house, but mine was very similar to this. I had a little veranda, and it was actually a very nice space to sort of sit with your back against the wall and, watch the world go by, and a nice wet place to interact with your neighbors. So we tried to introduce both of the kind of ideas into this building. So each apartment's got this sort of front veranda. And another of the things that I feel quite proud of with this project is that, and we had to fight quite hard for this, is that actually all the windows and doors that open out into the central circulation space are clear glass. There was a lot of pushback at first that, it should be frosted or there should be overlooking screens. And we were very concerned that that was going to ultimately result in a sort of, feeling of isolation between the internal life of the occupant. So what we did instead is provided curtains and blinds, so everyone's got their private terraces. Most of the time people keep their sort of windows and curtains open, and what's lovely is you walk through, you get little glimpses into people's lives. And if they want the privacy, they'll just close their curtains. It sort of seems obvious, but these are the battles that we sometimes have to have. The internal space of the apartments, again, just this idea of sort of really trying to keep it very sort of pared back, really a very much focus on quality and durability. And I think that's one of the other beautiful things about the way the assembled model works, is it's almost like a kind of try before you buy, in a sense, is that people can actually make sure that, everything does work really beautifully. The acoustics are great, thermally it performs really well, and that they haven't sort of bought something that, hasn't turned out to be any good. They've got a chance to really sort of experience it, and to experience the community as well. And I suppose that's the other really big focus, and I think it's very similar to sort of what Nightingale tries to do, is to make sure that all the apartments are, as good as they possibly can be from an amenity point of view. And I can certainly say the combination of the open corridor and the thermally broken frames is that this building's performed thermally absolutely beautifully. There's been incredibly little use of the air conditioning systems. We have got split systems in there, which are the sort of most energy efficient way to provide some heating and cooling, but they're used very, very little. And in fact, I think if we did this building over again, there's a good number of the apartments that wouldn't actually need air conditioning in them. This is the top floor, so you get up to the top of that walkway, sort of really opens out. And I suppose, again, on sort of materials, on these internal walkways, you just use a sort of natural finish, compressed fiber cement, really trying to avoid paints and things like that. Again, long-term maintenance, but also things that'll be kind of robust and age well. And then the communal room is a sort of improved version of what we did at in the first Assemble project, and some little diagrams about the sort of different things that can be done in there. But it's really designed to have a little kitchen space, a bathroom, a kind of little corner, which is a sort of library and sort of, I suppose, a bit of a kids' play area as well. It's got a linseed oil, a marmoleum sort of resilient flooring in there, and a little sort of barbecue area out the back as well. Our next project, I'm sort of taking up through the scales, is currently under construction in Brunswick, very, very close to Nightingale Village. And sort of all the sort of Nightingale projects. In fact, we're just a little bit further south in Brunswick. And it's a larger site. It's about 150 apartments. Sorry, 180 apartments. It was this really sort of quirky warehouse building. It's also this sort of modernist sort of warehouse building attached to this really funny sort of brick warehouse with those colored glass. It turned out it was actually all designed by the one architect. It looked like two sort of separate eras mushed together. But there was some specific heritage controls, but we actually were really, really keen to hang on to as much of this as we could. So we've sort of really tried to retain, and in fact, we've sort of retained the front few rooms of this warehouse. So as this sort of massing diagram, again, rather than do the sort of typical double-loaded corridor approach, what we did is to sort of open it up. This is a big U-shaped building. So what this has is it's got two cores that come up through the building, one southern core, one northern core, this big U-shaped building. Again, so that all the apartments have got that sort of lovely double frontage, proper cross-flow ventilation. We then sort of took that mass and carved it into a series of smaller modules. It was very important in this particular context, which is a context which is undergoing rapid change, is to make sure that the design is able to mediate between the sort of lower scale of the existing and this sort of larger scale that's starting to emerge, trying to be respectful of the kind of scale and character of the streetscape. So that's the sort of articulation story that we went through, and then I've got some plans, some very basic sort of, I'll take you through the plans, but essentially we've got on the northern end, a learning we had from the second assemble project is that there's a lot of, when people are moving and, this need almost for big goods lift. So in each project now, we've got a kind of passenger lift and a sort of big goods lift that you can put a queen size bed in. So there's big oversized lift there, communal workshop, bicycle repair sort of space, almost like a sort of cobbled laneway that takes you in. Through the middle, the sort of extensively landscaped space, and really one thing that we've realized with the project I just showed you before, Macaulay Road, is as the greenery has been really establishing itself in that central space, it's actually having a really wonderful cooling effect. So I didn't include a slide, I probably should have, but on the lowest level of that open walkway, it's almost like a sort of rainforest now. It's a really beautiful space to be in those very hot days. On the southern side, we've got a more sort of formal sort of lobby entry. And then as you go up through the building, you can see this is a sort of larger version of that idea, where, we've got all these apartments with dual frontage, and we've actually got here apartment typologies where you've actually got 2 bedrooms and then they sort of wrap around to a sort of living space and going up through the building. And then, unfortunately, in this project, we had to introduce a series of steps which do reduce the energy efficiency of the project, not the energy, sorry, the structural efficiency of the project. But we had to do that because of the sort of planning controls that we had. It's a very, very tricky thing, but, there's this real, a really strong push by councils here, to have these sort of podium and tower forms. And, I spend my life sort of battling against that a little bit. So here's some views of the building. Again, just trying to keep the materiality very, very simple, very sort of pared back materiality on the upper levels. These elements here that sort of step up the street as these sort of 4 little sort of sister buildings. We've retained that warehouse at the southern end, and that sort of funny modernist element to it. So that's all retained. We're punching a couple of openings into it in order to be able to have a more engaged sort of corner. the material of the forms going up the street are actually concrete with a crushed bluestone exposed aggregate. So sort of very rough, robust sort of materiality. And then on the lower levels, we've actually got apartments that face out onto the streetscape with sort of planter boxes. And we didn't want to sort of, you know, over enclose these. So there's a lot of debate, but what we've introduced is a bit of a gate and some very fine wires for creepers to grow up to give a bit of a sense of separation between the public realm and the private apartment. And then you can see here on the left-hand side, the multi-purpose communal workshop with a little sort of bench seat at the front. And this is a larger version. This is a larger community of the workshop with sort of more amenities in there. And then the staircase. Like Nightingale, you know, we always try and do our staircases as external wherever we possibly can, you know, try to run the sort of miserable, sort of enclosed fire stair that no one ever wants to use. You know, if you really try and celebrate the vertical circulation, open it up so you got views and, you know, beautiful breeze coming through, sort of lovely ventilation, it's much more likely that people are going to use it. The sort of lobby space, why did I put these circles on these doors? I don't know. I was feeling that they kind of got a bit of a bistro vibe. But I think what it was is that, you know, for our parcel room, and also I should mention that all assembled projects have got what's called the lending library, which is, it's a room with shelves covered in things that, it's the sort of things that you might only use, you know, once every few months, like a dehydrator or a slow cooker or a drill. And it's stuff that Assemble has purchased, and then people can also donate. So it's this really lovely sort of communal amenity where, you know, so for example, at, you know, where I live, we've got the lending library we set up there, and, you know, I use the dehydrator every, you know, few months, but I'm glad it's something I haven't bought and is using up my cupboard space. Some views of the sort of typical apartments, and again, with the sort of windows and glazing from both sides. And in this project, we've also got some much smaller units. So again, very much like Nightingale, you know, trying to find a way to bring the sort of price points down. So these are sort of roughly 40 square meter studio apartments. And then some of the communal amenities at the top. And then these two very large communal spaces adjacent to each other, which can then be sort of split with a folding door. And again, this is a sort of larger scale version. And the last project I want to take you through is the biggest Assemble project we've designed to date. It's also in the same neighborhood in the North, Brunswick, in the inner north, also not far from Nightingale Village. So in fact, it's just a little bit further south. It's about 200 meters south of the project I just showed you. It's on this main train line that runs north-south. And, you know, all the beautiful Nightingale projects are up on the top of the page. It's a very challenging and quite interesting site. It's an for a long time in the office, it was a confidential project, and it was called Project Bunny, because it was actually it was a factory that manufactured chocolate bunnies and Easter eggs. So when we went in there, was all these chocolate bunnies. So we called it Project Bunny for a while. It's next to Brunswick Station. It's got on it a little sort of industrial remnant. It's an old chimney, and quite a long time ago, not the previous owner, but you know, one of the ones before that was actually caught red-handed trying to knock this thing down with a sledgehammer by the heritage authorities, and it's literally in this half sort of demolished state. So you can see on the left-hand side there. So we're proposing to keep that chimney, not to restore it, but actually to kind of leave it like this kind of little urban ruin. Because you can see on the right-hand side, it's actually quite an important sort of landmark in Brunswick, you know. And in that area in Brunswick, there's still a lot of these beautiful little Victorian workers' cottages, and that's one of the tallest things that sticks out there. So for us, it was a really important element. And the site has got these very large sort of warehouse buildings on it, but it's surrounded, you can see on the left-hand side, by these sort of lovely sort of very Brunswick sort of scenes. And these occasional sort of very lovely, ornate and very elaborate Victorian terrace houses. This is directly opposite the site. So you can see a theme with this of these sort of diagrams. I really love doing these very simple diagrams. And, you know, when we teach at uni as well, we always try and emphasize to our students to just keep their diagrams as simple as possible to sort of explain, you know, the design thinking. So you can see the site there with the chimney in the middle, Brunswick Station, and then these two little heritage houses that we need to retain. And also they're being respectful of this little cluster of heritage Victorian terrace houses opposite. There's actually a proposal to raise the rail all the way along that section. So in Melbourne, we've had a very successful program of removing level crossings and putting this raised rails in, and actually quite lovely amenity being produced underneath them. So that's going to happen along this railway line. So that's something we have to design for. In Melbourne, we're often given these sort of design development envelopes to work with. So I suppose the starting point was to say, okay, well, this is the envelope that we have to work with. We were very keen to not introduce any cars into the site on the ground plane. So we wanted a fully sort of pedestrian environment. We wanted to introduce, you know, strong pedestrian connections and make it actually a very public ground floor, not privatizing that sort of ground floor. So these were diagrams sort of explaining how we wanted to redistribute some of the mass, because we wanted to, in some places, make the building taller than what the design development would allow us. But in other places, we were saying, look, we can make it lower. So it was this idea of sort of scooping the mass from one area and putting it, and taking it away from the areas where it might have more of an impact on neighbors, and putting it into the sort of center of the site where it's not going to overshadow anyone. And then, you know, this real challenge of saying, well, how can we, you know, have a 12-story building? In this case, the tallest portion is 12 stories. And how can we, you know, mediate that scale difference between the single-story terrace houses and this? And also, to be honest, a really big challenge for us in Brunswick is it's an incredibly diverse sort of urban environment. It's got its sort of beautiful charm. And certainly we didn't want to do, which a lot of new projects have been doing in Brunswick, which feels like they've sort of landed this sort of, you know, glass spaceship there. It wanted to feel like we picked up on elements of, you know, the kind of the local DNA. And we're very keen to make sure that the ground plane was super activated. So, you know, here's a diagram of that sort of pedestrianized ground plane, introduction of sort of landscape. And I should say that, you know, one of the, on every project we're trying to do this more with, you know, with Fieldwork is, you know, this notion of caring for country, and, you know, how can we design with country more, and starting to shift away from this idea of human-centered design, which feels like a very sort of early 2000s concept of saying, well, what does country-centered design mean? You know, what does it mean about, you know, trying to, you know, reintroduce little moments of habitat, or trying to peel back the layers and see what was there before. And something quite beautiful that's been occurring actually on the existing site is that, you know, because it was an empty site for a very long time, there's almost this natural wetland has happened in this hole that was in the ground there, and there's been frogs croaking there, and birds visiting. And we think, well, you know, how can we, you know, have something like that happen here? So the idea is to have this little pocket of sort of wetland and sort of an indigenous vegetation there, and have these sort of slightly tighter north-south laneways then come into the central space. And I should say that one of the things that's wonderful about working with Assemble these days is that we've got Andy Fergus, who's a, you know, very well-known, very respected urban designer. He's actually a resident in one of the Nightingale buildings as well. But we work very closely with him on our sort of urban strategies on the Assemble projects. So we've also got on the ground plane, you know, this idea of a real mix of functions, and the light purple functions are the Assemble facilities. So, you know, the communal rooms for Assemble, the parcel rooms, and then the darker blue are going to be office and co-working spaces. And then the very light blue are a mix of all different hospitality spaces. So I guess in this project, we're very happy that we didn't end up, you know, having to put a big supermarket or something like that. We've actually been able to put a real diversity and fine grain of ground plane uses in order to you know, I suppose maintain that sort of diversity and activation on the ground plane. We've also got the lobbies as these sort of through links. So each of the lobbies is a bicycle access into the bicycle storage, but also through links to buildings so that the residents of the buildings can go through. But of course, the main north, south, and east-west laneways will be public 24 hours a day. So the buildings, as they sort of step up, we've introduced a series of steps and then really expressing the vertical circulation on the outside, sort of really trying to celebrate that. We realized straight away that, you know, a successful ground plane was going to be the key to this project being successful. So we did a sort of study of, and Brunswick truly is a very quirky neighborhood. It's a beautiful neighborhood. And we just did a series of studies of all the little shop fronts in the immediate area around the project. And so that led us to develop a series of these little vignettes. So we were very keen to make sure that the building had these little moments of, I suppose, little interesting moments of kind of character and interface. So introducing little moments of tiling and timber door frames and little canopies and really sort of thinking through these little moments of interface. And, you know, it's it very often one can overlook when one's thinking about building, about creating this big sort of heroic gesture, but really, you know, a tall building that has very carefully considered its ground plane is a much more successful part of the urban landscape than a smaller building that's just completely neglected its ground plane, you know. So I really emphasized to you the importance of getting these lower levels right and sort of thinking about them. And it very much comes down to sort of to the detail and how you transition scale and thinking about things like wind and how you can sort of help modulate that as well. So we've got some details here. We're sort of introducing cloth awnings. In Melbourne, a lot of the councils try and force you to do these long, solid canopies and end up being these big, chunky, horrible things. So this is us trying to say, well, how can you provide some measure of sort of solar protection, but, you know, in a more beautiful sort of a way. And I guess to that point of kind of picking up on local DNA is this idea of, you know, what are the sort of materials that feel right for the area? And, you know, so we've got elements of recycled and reclaimed brickwork. We've got little elements of sort of glazed tiling, galvanized metal, and some of these sort of little vignettes. This building here on the corner is actually proposed to be built entirely out of bricks reclaimed from the warehouse that we're demolishing on the site. And in fact, we're even sort of taking the galvanized metal to these balconies and folding them, you know, the way that you sort of fold air conditioning ducting. So that's just a little bit of sort of Brunswick DNA in there. And here's a series of images of the project. We're doing this sort of very quirky little hand-stacked brick corner, sort of wrapping around there. And this is very much, you know, trying to balance, you know, repetition and structural efficiency, but at the same time, that kind of idea of respect and stepping down and kind of trying to create this sort of amalgam of different sort of buildings. And here you can see that sort of laneway running north-south. And in each case, trying to frame a view, the key sort of views to the chimney. So making sure that can stay as its sort of role as a bit of kind of landmark in the local area. And then the way the sort of building steps down and giving some breathing room to these little Victorian terrace houses. And then also those connections through. And a lot of, you know, getting these urban spaces right is about sort of tightness as well. You know, not just having these big expanses of space, but narrowing down and opening up, but always sort of, you know, view to kind of safety and design and making sure there's no sort of dark and sort of dodgy corners as well. And then
5 minutes, okay?
Absolutely, that's pretty much on the second last slide. So that's perfect timing. Thank you, Mike. And a couple more views coming around to the back. And then, yeah, really just finish on this last slide and, you know, saying that, you know, what we're trying to achieve with every one of our projects for Assemble, but also just across Fieldwork, is this idea of, you know, we really think there's a possibility of a kind of win-win project, you know, that actually when you introduce a new building to an area, it shouldn't mean a detraction or loss to the local area, that actually it can be a win for, you know, the residents, it can be a win for the broader community. And for us, the really big focus now in Fieldwork, and I think we've just turned 10, our next 10 years are going to be mostly focused on the environmental impact of our buildings. You know, I think as a profession, that's where we are really still having much more of an impact than we should be. And so with Fieldwork, the huge push at the moment is decarbonization of construction. So that's really our really big push. You know, we certainly are, as architects, using much too much concrete. Thank you.
Thank you, Quino. And I sort of felt the need to apologise to both of you for the inability on Zoom to have a huge round of applause. But perhaps anyone who's got access to their applause button could click that and we can virtually applaud you. But yeah, wonderful body of work there too, clearly, Quino, and thanks for such a great presentation. I've got a fair number of questions and might run through 3 or 4 of them. One's around, you've both focused to a far greater degree on building community than traditional medium density housing does. What does that do? And this sounds like a boring approach, but what does that do to the governance and psychology of maintenance? For example, the resented resident who doesn't maintain their planter box in a traditional medium density housing environment. How does the finances, governance, and sort of attitudinal dimensions work for that? Gardens and building.
Do you want to go first, Toby? I'm sure that's an issue with you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And Quino, thanks for that presentation. It was great to hear about your projects in more detail, and especially you living within one. You know, I think it's something that's incredible. Is you live in one, and I lived in one, and we'll live in a Nightingale project again soon. So it's just great to hear people, as you've said, Mark, like talk about the community and the activity and everything that's going on as much as they're talking about the buildings.
You've got to taste your own medicine, don't you, Toby? I think it's like, I think it'd be very hypocritical of me sort of trying to encourage everyone to sort of live in apartments and, you know, live in a big mansion in Brighton or something, you know?
Absolutely. Yeah. Mark, to your question on usability and, caring for the building, custodianship, whatever it might be. I think there are differences in whether it will be a rental model where the operator or the person may have to care for those spaces, and there may be, I'm not sure how Assemble's projects work, but I think there's sometimes like a building operations person or someone that may work down in cassette that's able to help with those kind of things. For Nightingale properties, they are strata titled. So people purchase individual lots and they pay an owner's corporation fee. Now that fee goes towards things like a green caretaker or a gardener and for maintenance of common facilities. And it's up to the committee or the community, or the owner's corporation is the correct term, to decide on how they allocate their budget. If they wish to take on more of those duties themselves, they are able to. But we also, and Fieldwork, like that landscaping at the Clifton, at that Roseneath Street project looks incredible. We also try and design plants that are resilient, that are hard wearing. We irrigate on a timer system. And so there's kind of areas that are landscaped to survive without much input. And then there's areas that the residents can kind of fill in and change themselves. So it's a tricky one. There'll always be a resident that kills their planter box. You know, that is going to happen. And I think people just have to recognize that that's part of living in a community. You can't resent that. You know, who knows what's going on in that person's life. But we do try and build structures that support one another in the building as well. So, yeah.
Okay, Quino?
Yeah, look, you've made some, lovely points there, Toby. I mean, I think that, if you sort of provide really sort of dignified housing for people, I think people tend to, treat it in a sort of respectful and careful way. I mean, I suppose, it's been very interesting working on the social housing where we've got, a lot more, potentially a bit more of a challenging cohort, sort of designing a building so that, that if there is some residents who, there's in social housing, people who've got sort of mental health issues, we did a lot of sort of tours of social housing projects, and you know, we realized that you have to design it so that, you know, the building kind of accepts a variety of different people. And, you know, if someone is a bit messy, it doesn't sort of ruin it for everyone else. You know, like an example is we never use glass balustrading, for example. You know, like in social housing, we've got, you know, solid balustrading a little bit taller than you normally would, try and really make sure that people feel very sheltered and very, you know, sort of there's that level of sort of privacy. And yeah, Toby, you mentioned as well about the sort of idea of, you know, working out what's communally maintained and what's privately maintained. So we certainly try and make sure that all the sort of main landscape is communally maintained. So, you know, that actually, you know, the body corporate's taking care of it, so you can make sure that's maintained to a really high standard. But, you know, to be honest, I also kind of like a bit of messiness in the building, you know. It's been really wonderful on the Assemble projects, people's sort of inner life spilling out into that central walkway. It's been really a lovely thing. You know, it's lovely when at Roseneath Street, the first Assemble project, you know, there's been kids playing together on the walkway, and there's, you know, balls and little bikes and chalk drawings on the walkway. So it's a lovely thing.
Great. Look, got a very simple question, but it might need a less than simple response, and that is, how do you determine ceiling heights in the units? Is everything 2.4? Is it 2.7? And why?
Ours are typically 2.7 to 2.9 for standard spaces. There can sometimes be a drop ceiling in the bathroom if there's things like additional ventilation. But we keep it at that. Quino can probably give more, you know, in regards to planning and design, but that's what we standard on Nightingale. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right, Toby. I mean, look, there's standards that we need to achieve here in Melbourne, but also, you know, in our own sort of research and our own projects, you know, it feels very, you know, appropriate to have a sort of at least a 2.7 living space. You know, you wouldn't want to be any lower than 2.7, you know, floor to ceiling in the living space. We try and push it to sort of 2.8, 2.9 where we can, and bedrooms sort of 2.4. You know, it's about what feels good in spaces. Of course, we'd always like to make everything taller, but it's always those sort of balances of, you know, what's going to be sort of cost efficient, what's going to feel good for the proportion of the space. And yeah, 2.7 to 2.9 tend to feel really good. And no more than 2.4 and no lower than 2.4 in bedrooms. Yeah.
Okay. Next question on a totally different tack. So what account do you take for climate change? As in, you're designing in 2024 for a building that'll be occupied still in 2050. You did mention flooding. There's other dimensions such as urban heat island effects and so on. What cognizance is there in the design process of ongoing climate change?
Yeah. I think.
Thank you, Stephanie, for that.
Yeah, good question. I think we're both quite open on the mistakes we've made in previous projects. You know, the first Nightingale building, same thing, had gas. It is incredibly difficult to retrofit air conditioning into the first Nightingale building. I think for us, firstly, it's about trying to reduce your embodied carbon, thinking about the bigger picture first. So trying to choose all materials that have a pathway to zero carbon, firstly, is one thing. And then in regards to apartment design, I think it's about that tightly sealed thermal envelope is incredibly important as long as there's an ability to ventilate. And I think there's that level of adaptability. In some of our new projects now, we may provide things like an air conditioner rough-in, so that in 30 years, when the climate does increase in temperature, for example, that resident can go and put in an aircon and there's a pre-designed air conditioning screen and whatever it might be. So there's that. I think just, you know, natural ventilation. There's so many things, and climate isn't just like temperature and environmental impact. It's that we may have a huge influx of climate refugees in Australia, you know, or people that are experiencing more disadvantage. It generally affects poorer people as well. So It's such a big thing to design into a building. There's physical things you can do, but it's a big problem.
Yes, I think you sort of think about it, and there's two sort of aspects to it. So one is, what are the environmental impacts of the building from a construction operation point of view? And then the other one is actually, how's the building going to be able to adapt to changing environment, especially these big heat waves and stuff. So starting with the latter, it's really, like Toby said, it's making sure you've got a really efficient thermal envelope. And the second project I showed you, Macaulay Road, I want to reshoot it because that walkway is now so lush and green and beautiful that actually it's going to be a space that, and already has been through some very hot days. It copes really, really well with hot temperatures, even without the air conditioning. The cross flow ventilation, for example, because that's the sort of impacts we're going to be dealing with. We're going to be dealing with more extreme temperatures, so there's going to be longer heat waves. We did put air conditioning unit split systems into all of the apartments, so they can do heating, and look, if they do need cooling in these long heat waves, a very, very, very large solar system. And I think on projects, we're trying to push harder and harder to have more and more energy self-sufficiency within the building itself. Ideally, where we'd get to is have batteries as well. So if there's power, because the worst case scenario is that you have a power outage and a heat wave at the same time. Yeah. So that's, I think one of the things that we need to sort of design for. In terms of the environmental impact of the building itself, I mean, I mentioned it very briefly at the sort of end of my talk, but the big challenge is how we reduce the environmental impact of our buildings and construction materials. And really the big one is trying to decarbonize the embodied sort of carbon in buildings. So timber structure. Timber structure is one of the key things that we've got to really sort of push for. Yeah.
Okay. Let's just do two more. One is what's the role of simplicity, simplification, repetition in the design of affordable housing? Talking, for example, I would imagine the reference might be to the same bathroom layout or design through a whole complex.
Yeah. Kino, do you want to start off?
Yeah, sure. No, absolutely. I mean, I suppose Assemble's really trying to deliver, affordable housing at scale, and a big part of it, and I suppose it's a little bit of an experiment at the moment, but seeing what sort of scale of projects can work. We're still trying to break the communities down to sort of roughly 50 apartments. So it might be 100 apartment project, but each core maybe only services 50. But repetition is a really key one. Like we try and make all the kitchens exactly the same in the whole building, for example, so that why, if we don't have to, why spend extra money and effort to, well, not effort, but extra money on all different kitchen types, if we can just get one kitchen type and deliver that at scale, and be able to pass on the cost benefits to the purchasers. And it's the same with I mentioned the structural efficiency, but we work very, very hard on our projects to try and get that sort of sense of repetition and structural simplicity, that's why our buildings aren't these sort of very sculptural things, we just want the buildings to, be quite sensible about the sort of structural approach, and being very sensible about the way the services are done as well.
Mm.
And in fact, the geometry of the project, Quino, so you've got a very rectilinear outcome there, delightful, but for the most part, pretty simple geometry.
Well, that's right. Sort of, wiggly balconies don't make your life better necessarily. They don't. They're going to, if you can still make something that's going to be attractive and but simple, I think, is the key. But I think that's not to say you shouldn't be focusing on like joy and delight and beauty and architecture. I mean, I really think that getting beautiful natural light in and a lovely breeze through your apartment, and materials which are going to age well, that's a beautiful thing. Not all this unnecessary sort of decoration and things like that.
I think I agree so much with what Kino's been saying, and from a Nightingale perspective, there's this there's also we don't always have to do better or different. You know, sometimes if something has worked really well and it has a low impact on the environment and the design's good, you know, we can save costs by replicating that, by not designing it again, by not trying to change it. That can, you know, save time and costs and things like that. But agreeing with Quino in that there's a level where repetition is good and simplicity is good, and but there needs to be some, exactly as Quino said, kind of delight and flourishes that make it a beautiful place to live in. It doesn't have to be over designed. It can be very flexible, adaptable spaces, but you know, there's a point, I think, with repetition and simplicity. It's probably hard to put your finger on it, but I think it does exist. Yeah,
that's exactly right. We
Some
always try to strike
complexity.
that balance. Yeah.
yeah,
Some sort of visual complexity comes through landscape anyway. So you've
Yeah.
both sort of introduced landscape
and
pretty
just
heavily
people,
into.
you know,
Yeah,
that
sure.
mess that might be outside someone's door.
Yeah.
Good thing.
Okay, look, I think we'll leave it there and give everyone an extra 15 minutes of their life back. Again, a big virtual applause from everybody. We really appreciate you taking the time at this time of the day to share your learnings from your wonderful projects with us. So thank you indeed on behalf of all the students.
It's an absolute pleasure. And thank you so much, Toby, for the presentation. I really enjoyed listening to you as well. So thanks very much.
See you soon. Thank you, Mark.
Okay, yep. And thank you to everyone who's attended.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.